Hello everyone, this is Professor Casey. Today we're discussing an introduction to The Lord of the Flies, our reading for the semester. This presentation is going to include just some background information about the story itself, about the author, and then we're going to get into looking at the first couple of chapters and kind of starting our journey into literary analysis. Okay, this is something that you will eventually be called upon to do in future classes, primarily the English composition classes and literature courses if you do end up taking them as electives, or if you happen to become an English major, it's something that you'll see quite often. Okay, so I want to kind of give you a little bit of exposure to some of this early on, so that way once you are actually called upon to do it as an assignment, you are a little bit more familiar with it and it feels a little bit more comfortable. Okay. So beginning with the author himself, okay, we have to give a little bit of background information about him just to kind of put things in perspective in terms of what it is he writes about. The author's name is William Golding. You see his picture here on the right. He was born in 1911 and he died in 1993. He was born in Cornwall in England. Okay, Cornwall is on the southwestern corner of England. Okay, it's kind of on a long peninsula that comes to a very tip at the end of England. He attended Brasenose College, Oxford, from 1930 to 1934, so he was a very well-educated man. He also enlisted in the Royal Navy during World War II, okay, so he does have military experience. And Lord of the Flies, his seminal work, the one that he is the most well known for, was published in September of 1954. Okay. Eventually, he is awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1983 and was even granted a knighthood in 1988 by Queen Elizabeth II. Okay, so he has a pretty well-decorated life and career for the most part. Okay. And all these things put together actually end up informing the way that he approaches the subject matter of the book that we're talking about. Okay, and this is an important thing to consider anytime that you are reading a book, anytime that you have to, analyze a piece of literature or something. If you know anything at all about the author, it's a good idea to take a look at the author's life, what he or she believes in, what kind of culture he or she comes from, because quite often this is what ends up informing the way that the author thinks and the way that they approach the subject matter in question. Okay, so sometimes they bring their own thoughts and belief systems into play. Sometimes they call upon their own experience, and it kind of helps you, determine whether or not the author is reliable and whether or not they're able to effectively write about something that maybe they know a lot about or maybe they know virtually nothing about. Okay, so it's sometimes it's tricky to take that into consideration, but in this particular case, I think it informs quite a bit about what you end up seeing over the course of the story. And at this point in the story, we know virtually nothing about the story. Okay, approaching it as something that you may never have read before, you probably know nothing about it. Okay, if you have read the story before, then you're kind of in for a little bit of a rehash here. Okay. But taking all this into consideration, think about the fact that this is a white male living in England during the 20th century. Okay? And all those things taken into consideration tell us a lot about the author himself. Okay, we know, for example, that he is in fact a Christian. Okay, based on his religious beliefs, that does kind of end up bleeding into the story a little bit when we start seeing the characters and so forth. More specifically, he was a member of the Church of England. Okay, this is a very specific sect of Christianity, Protestant Christianity in the 20th century. And being a British man who enlisted in the Royal Navy, okay, he has certain sense of duty to his country, right? Might have a bit of patriotism going on, okay? We know that he was educated at Oxford, so he is, again, very well educated. He's very intelligent, and he's able to call upon these different things to kind of inform the way that his characters view the world as well. And again, we know nothing about the story yet. We know nothing about the characters yet, but thinking of all these things, his characters tend to reflect his personality in some ways. Okay? So again, this is something that you can think about a little bit as we get into the story. Now, in terms of the story itself, Lord of the Flies is extremely thematic when it comes to human nature. Okay, this is something that he is very keen to take a close look at in the course of the story when it comes to the characters themselves. Okay. And this is a book that was written, again, in 1954, okay? And the time period that the book itself was written is another very important factor here, because this was written right in the midst of the Cold War, okay? And I'm a history teacher in addition to being an English teacher here, so I can kind of call upon this a little bit. The Cold War was a period that lasted from the end of World War II in 1945 all the way until 1990. Okay, so this is an extremely long period of time in which the United States and its allies were engaged in what we call a Cold War with the Soviet Union, which is made up of Russia and several Baltic countries. Okay, so what this basically amounts to is the term Cold War basically means that the United States and the Soviet Union never got into a direct physical conflict with one another. Okay, they used other countries, they used other means of fighting with one another without engaging in open combat on a battlefield. Okay, so the United States would quite often get into a fight with an ally of the Soviet Union. This is where we get the Korean War. This is where we get the Vietnam War. This is where we get the first war in Afghanistan during the 1980s. So all these major conflicts that we see throughout the course of the middle to late portion of the 20th century are all a part of the Cold War. Okay, so if you ever take any history courses, if you take mine especially, you'll definitely hear about the Cold War, kind of how it ends up affecting culture and so forth. But this mindset that comes with the Cold War is what's so important to the story, because this is something that we refer to as a dichotomy. Okay, and I'll show you the term here in a minute. A dichotomy is where we have two sides that are diametrically opposed to one another and are fighting for control over something. Okay, so a dichotomy, simple dichotomies in most people's minds are good versus evil, right? Light versus dark, right? One thing versus another, okay? And again, when it comes to things like the author's religion, for example, Christianity, okay, this is a very heavy thing that plays into the belief system, okay? And during the Cold War in particular, right, we had two different sides fighting. We had the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. Again, a dichotomy. Okay? And we also can refer to this as the First World fighting against the Second World. Okay? The First World is the United States and its allies. The Second World is the Soviet Union and its allies. Parenthetically here, the Third World, which you may have heard of before, okay, Third World countries are any countries that were not directly allied with the U.S. or the Soviet Union. Okay? So again, these types of dichotomies start to spill into the story itself. Okay? So the primary dichotomy that we'll be looking at over the duration of this story, something that we'll bring up time and time again here, is the idea of what the author hints at is something like civilization versus savagery. Okay, and these two particular elements here, the two sides of this, are terms that are extremely subjective. Okay, it's not exactly something we can look at and say we can directly define it as this or this. Okay, civilization, of course, is something where a lot of people have specific ideas of what it means. Okay, it might mean culture, it might mean rich history, rich ethnic backgrounds, religion. It might have physical structures involved, lasting effects on the world. Right? It might have a lot of different things involved. Okay, so whatever your idea of civilization is, sometimes it means something that is ordered, that has law, that has some kind of permanence to it, perhaps. Savagery, on the other hand, is a very loaded term, okay, and this is something that carries a lot of negative weight with it, okay, and especially with the way that the author starts to look at things specifically through the lens of Christianity, through the lens of Great Britain, okay, all these types of things. Savagery has a very again, a very negative connotation with it, okay? Savagery could simply mean having a barbaric attitude toward others, right? It might pertain to violence. It might pertain to, right, unenlightened ways of thinking. It might pertain to, and this is, again, where things start to, the line between, you know, what we might consider good and bad ends up blurring a little bit, okay? Savagery in the mind of a 20th century British man who is very well educated is basically any culture that is not Great Britain and is not Christianized and is not permanent. Okay, so again, calling a society savage is something that in modern terms, of course, we would consider to be very culturally insensitive. Okay, it can be potentially offensive to some people. And it doesn't really take into account a full-fledged appreciation of the culture. There's a barrier here. Okay, so a savage culture, for example, in the mind of someone like the author, might potentially be a tribal culture of some sort. And again, this is something that is potentially very culturally insensitive, so we have to tread lightly here. Okay. Calling a culture savage might be looking at their belief systems. It might involve, some sort of sacrifice of a living creature, a human being, perhaps. Might involve some sort of pagan rituals of some sort that the author in particular might look at as being dark or savage or inhumane or something like that. So depending on what your idea of civilization is, that tends to inform what your idea of savagery is. Okay, so this is again, something that is going to be very subjective to you as the reader. Okay, and it's not your version of this is not going to be my version of this, and it's not going to be the same way that your classmates think about this either. Okay, so each individual who reads this book might come away from it with a very different feeling and a very different idea of what is going on here. Okay, so again, this is something that's just part and parcel of what you see with literary analysis. Okay, there's a lot of psychology involved. There's a lot of history involved, a lot of sociology involved. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. Okay, so we'll try to take it piecemeal as we go along. Another thing that we can talk about here is something called groupthink versus individuality. Okay, and this is important because what we're looking at here is in the situation of the story in particular, we see characters who are put into a situation where they have to either cooperate with one another or go against one another. Okay. The idea of groupthink is something that you see quite often in big businesses, okay, major corporations. It's a situation where you have a group of individuals who are underlings to somebody else, okay? They are a group of workers who are working for a boss of some kind. And the idea of groupthink is basically where the boss puts forward an idea, and all the people underneath him or her are required to agree, right? Or they are at least expected to agree, whether they actually agree or not. Okay, so sometimes they agree out of fear of being left out of fear of losing their job, of losing promotion, of falling in disfavor with the boss, right? There's a lot of factors here. Usually it's some sort of fear that's involved in groupthink, right? Being singled out is something that a lot of people don't like, okay? So that's what groupthink is. And of course, the opposite of that is individuality, right? Not conforming to what everybody else does or thinks, but instead actually creating your own opinions, your own identity, and standing perhaps alone in that, right? You might actually become an outcast as a result, or you might be celebrated for your individuality, right? It's a risk. There's a risk that comes with being an individual. Okay, it could potentially cost you your life in certain situations, depending on what's going on. But it could also, again, lead to some sort of celebrity status for you, right? This is, again, how some celebrities gain their celebrity status. Okay. Another thing that we think about here, too, is something called rationality versus emotionality. Okay, and again, part of this has to do with the fact that the author is a white British male living in the 20th century. Okay, the stereotype of a white British man living during this time period would be someone who has a very stoic personality, right? Someone who has a very stiff upper lip, who doesn't show emotion very easily, who is strong and proud and unfazed by the world around them. Okay, and that's where the rational side of things appears. Okay, rationality is showing, grace under fire, right? If you are in the midst of a crisis, you don't show emotion, you just handle the situation and move on. Okay, and it's kind of what is expected of a white male living during this time period. Okay? Emotionality, again, tends to fall in the other category. Okay, this is something that is in some people's minds anyway, considered to be a weakness. Okay, showing emotion, especially if you are a male, in many cultures is considered to be a weakness of some kind. Okay, in the 21st century now, of course, we've started to move past that. Right, males are not considered to be, emotionless beings anymore. Right, we don't look at that as necessarily being a weakness in all situations. But quite often, again, during this time period that we're discussing here, it is something that is even considered unmanly. It can be considered feminine in a negative way. Okay, this is still before the feminist movements started to happen in the 20th century. And so women and emotions and all those types of things are somehow considered weak in the midst of this particular setting. Okay, so the characters in the story have to contend with that as well, right? Do they show emotion in the midst of what's going on? Do they remain rational? Right? There's all kinds of there seems to be some sort of a danger associated with emotion, right? If you give in to emotions, not only does it make you weak, it can potentially make you seem unpredictable, okay, for better or for worse. Okay, so once we get into the story itself, you'll start to see how this will make more sense. And another idea here too is ideas of morality versus immorality. Okay, and morality is again a very subjective term. Okay, everybody approaches morals with their own personal belief system, whether it is religious, whether it is ethical. Right, religion doesn't necessarily have to play into this. Okay, but again, for the mindset of the author himself, right, he brings this idea of Christianity into the mix. And again, kind of an emotionless version of this, not necessarily where there's a lot of open praise or anything like that, right? The Church of England, if you've ever seen one of their religious ceremonies or whatever, it seems to be very quiet, very structured, very ritualistic. Okay, so it's not exactly not like a Pentecostal Christian church service would be today, right? There's not a lot of crying and jumping around, and not a lot of emotion and music and that kind of thing. Okay, it's a very different type of thing. And so the opposite end of that is immorality, right? What is considered immoral? Okay, there is usually a line that is blurred in this, right? There's not exactly a two very distinct sides to this. Okay, sometimes people will say this is a gray area. Okay, it's not something that is either one or the other. And of course, in the midst of all this, too, is the idea of power and corruption. Okay, and not necessarily as a dichotomy, but as two things that go together. Okay, the old saying goes, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely." Okay, this is where we get the idea of a dictatorship. Okay, someone who is granted absolute power is going to become corrupted over time. Okay, and it happens in almost every single instance. Okay, something goes wrong where someone else is hurt in the process. Okay, and in the process of the story, right, we see individuals who end up coming into power, and we see how that power ends up corrupting them to a certain extent. And this book became so popular for all of these different themes that we're talking about here, all these dichotomies, the examination of human nature, and the way that we view the world and everything. It became a standard reading in most schools by the time the 1960s came around, right? Only about 5 years after the book was published. And it's been a staple diet of just about every American student ever since, right? Most people will see this book, hear about it, or learn something about it in the course of their education because it's so profound. And this has been made into a couple of film adaptations. Okay, the first one that you see here on the left was published in 1963, or debuted in 1963, I should say, less than 10 years after the book itself was published. And then there was a remake that was done in 1990, right? Both of them have the same name as the book, Lord of the Flies. The first film adaptation is in black and white and is actually a little bit more faithful to the book itself. Okay, it's not exactly verbatim, right? It's not word for word exactly, but it's pretty close. The remake done in 1990 is more Americanized and it's modernized. Okay. because it's done in 1990, right? This is done right after the Cold War ended. Okay, so it's got a modern flavor to it, and it changes elements of the story, but it's much more intense. Okay, it's actually R-rated. It's more violent, and it kind of pushes the point a little bit more about the element of violence and so forth that takes place in the story. Okay, so and the good thing about these two, as far as I know, at least for now, both of these movies are available in full on YouTube. Okay, so if you want to watch one or both versions of this, just to kind of see the characters and understand the story as it happens, go ahead and go check it out on YouTube. Okay, just search Lord of the Flies film, and both films should pop up. Okay, you can watch both of them, I think, without commercials, without having to pay for anything. Now, something that we also need to take a look at here, and this is something that is kind of our first step into literary analysis. Now that we've talked a little bit about some of the major themes that occur in the course of the story and everything, now we can start thinking about characters, okay? Because characters tend to drive many stories in the history of literature, okay? We tend to latch on to characters. They are what typically keeps us interested in the story, because they are the human element in many cases. Okay? So there's several different ways that we can think about characters and how they are important to us. Okay? The first way goes along with what we've discussed already when it comes to the themes of the story. Okay? And we typically, here in Western culture anyway, we typically tend to think of characters and many things, right, like themes, ethical beliefs, religion, right, all these types of things, in terms of a way that is called dualistic thinking. Okay? And this is something that has informed Western culture for many hundreds and even thousands of years, quite frankly. Again, a dualistic way of thinking is, or a dichotic way of thinking, right? This is where we get the term dichotomy, okay? Tends to be one thing versus another thing, okay? We like to separate things into two different things, right? Good and bad, right and wrong, light and dark, etc. Okay, and for better or for worse in some cases, this tends to inform, again, the way that our culture has evolved over time. Okay, specifically, this happens when it comes to religion. Okay, so when we see a lot of the major religions of the world, okay, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, even Zoroastrianism, and some other religions that are kind of going extinct in some cases, or at least have a minority in some cases. These religions tend to have a sense that there is an absolute good and an absolute evil. Okay, a lot of the ancient religions, the more polytheistic religions, pagan religions, and so forth, didn't necessarily have this idea. Okay, things were a little bit more, there was a lot more gray area, lines were blurred between deities and figures who were good and bad. But when it comes to the more widespread ways of thinking, again, for better or for worse, people tend to think of things in good and evil, light and dark terms. And this also tends to be the way that we look at each other, right, as human beings, right? Right. If you're walking down the street and you see an individual pass you on the sidewalk, a lot of times people tend to, we do exactly what society tells us not to do. We judge a book by its cover. Okay, we look at a person and we try to make assumptions about them. Are they approachable? Are they good? Are they bad? Right, based on just the way they appear. Okay, and it's something that we have tried to weed out in terms of the way that we think as a culture and as a society, but we still haven't gotten there. Okay, and there's plenty of evidence for it all around us. Right, there is rampant racism. There are gender stereotypes. There are, there's xenophobia, right? We fear people that we don't understand. We fear ideas that we don't understand. And so this is still something that's so very heavily embedded in our culture, in Western culture in particular, okay, that we have a hard time getting away from it, okay? And so when it comes to looking at characters, we tend to oversimplify things very heavily, just like we do everything else. So the way that we think about characters most often in Western culture, again, it's not always right or wrong to do this, right? Again, it's not always that simple. But the way that we tend to do this is we usually are looking in a story for what we call a protagonist. Okay? And the oversimplified way of looking at a protagonist is the quote-unquote good guy. Okay, the protagonist is not always a good person or a good character. Okay, they don't always have positive or selfless ambition going on here. Okay, it's usually supposed to be the character that the reader follows throughout the course of a story and is someone that the reader is supposed to care about somehow. Okay, and again, a protagonist is not always a scrupulous character. Okay, it's not always a character who is a good person. Okay. The opposite of the protagonist, the other side of that dichotomy or that dualism, is if you have a good guy, you have to have a bad guy, quote unquote. Okay? And the more proper term for this is the antagonist. Okay? It's someone who is the opposite of the protagonist. Okay? Someone that the reader looks at through the eyes of the protagonist, and the protagonist and the antagonist, again, are usually opposed to one another. Okay? They are two sides of the same coin. They are two sides of an argument or a conflict of some kind. Okay? So the good guy is usually looking at the bad guy as someone who is working against them somehow. And again, this is not always so simple as calling the protagonist a good person and the antagonist a bad person. Okay, it's not always that easy. Okay, in many cases, a protagonist to a story might be a character who is very unsavory, right? Someone who we are supposed to care about, but who is very difficult for us to care about in some ways. Okay, and maybe the antagonist is actually someone that we think might be the good guy. Okay, and this is something that challenges readers all throughout the history of literature. Okay, this is not a new idea by any sense of the imagination, but it's something that we tend to not look at because it challenges the way that we think about things traditionally speaking. Okay, and there's several examples that come across in this. Okay, one of the earliest and most famous versions of this is an epic poem written in the 17th century called Paradise Lost. Okay, and unsurprisingly, this is actually something that is written through the lens of Christianity, right? A very thick lens, by the way, in which our protagonist in the story is actually Satan. Okay, it's the devil himself being cast out of heaven. Okay, in the traditional Christian story of this, okay, the devil is somehow rises up against God in some way, makes a rebellion against God, and God casts the devil out, and he falls from grace. He used to be an angel. Now he is a devil. He sets up a kingdom in hell and becomes the mortal enemy, or immortal enemy, I guess, of God ever since. Okay. And in this particular story, again, this is an epic poem. This is something that is, several hundreds or thousands of lines long. It translates into a book, basically, in which the devil is cast as a sympathetic character. Okay, and he's more humanized, right? We see him as being someone who perhaps had other alternative motives, right? Something that we don't really think about in terms of the devil, right? We automatically assume him a character who is literally demonized, right? We hate him for whatever reason. But in this particular case, the devil is cast as someone we are supposed to care about. We see how much he suffers. We see, just the cover itself there. You see Lucifer as being a former angel who now has bat wings, right? And he's dealing with that in that particular moment. But again, it's something that we don't always think about, right? Most people don't consider the devil to be a sympathetic protagonist of some kind. But over the course of the story, he becomes an engaging character, right? He becomes someone that we are supposed to care about. We follow his progress, and we see exactly what happens over the course of the story. Again, it's all completely fictionalized, though, right? It's something that we, whether this is someone or something that exists objectively, take from that what you will, but it makes for compelling reading, if nothing else. Right? Another example of this coming from literature takes the traditional Norse story of Beowulf, right? Something that becomes standard reading for a lot of people in high school and even in some cases in college, and takes the typical antagonist of that story, a monster named Grendel, who you see here on the cover, and turns Grendel into a sympathetic character. Okay? In the original story of Beowulf, Beowulf is kind of this Viking character who comes to the aid of a kingdom who is being besieged by a monster. Okay, the monster is Grendel here. And in the course of the story, Beowulf ends up getting into hand-to-hand combat with Grendel and rips Grendel's arm off. Okay, Grendel goes away and dies somewhere in the wilderness. Okay, and in this particular instance, in the traditional story, of course, Beowulf is the traditional protagonist, right? He's the big, heroic, strong, good guy. Okay, and Grendel is the antagonist, right? He's an inhuman monster who's been killing and eating people. Okay, but in John Gardner's book, right, Grendel is turned into a sympathetic figure, right? He's kind of a misguided, misunderstood monster, right? Kind of like the Universal Studios Frankenstein from the 1930s, right? Some monster who people fear because they don't understand him, right? He looks strange, he looks scary. And Beowulf is depicted as the real monster here, right? Someone who kills an unarmed creature who is completely misunderstood. Okay, puts a completely different spin on what we typically think of in the traditional sense. Okay, and there's plenty of modern versions of this too. Okay, there was a storybook that came out in the 1990s, I believe. It was back when I was a kid, really. It's called The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. Okay, and this goes back to right the Grimm's fairy tale, right, about the three little pigs, right? Three pigs who are seemingly harmless, who are, they build their own houses. They're industrious little creatures, right? They build one house out of straw, one out of wood, and one out of brick. Okay, and a big bad wolf wants to come along and eat all three of them. Okay, and so he huffs and he puffs and he blows down the house made out of straw. He does the same thing to the wooden house, and eventually all three pigs shelter in the brick house, and the wolf is unable to blow it away. Okay. And that's kind of the end of the story for one, just for basic reasons. This particular version of it here, this quote unquote true story of the three little pigs, again, puts the whole story on its head, right? The big bad wolf is really a wolf who has a cold and he can't help it, right? He sneezes, and every time he sneezes, he accidentally blows away one of their houses. And the three little pigs start thinking that he is there to eat them. They start taunting him, and they start acting very cruel to him, and he tries to tell them, oh, this is, a mistake or whatever. Of course, in the story, in this version of it, he actually eats each one of the pigs in turn to cover up evidence, right, to make sure it doesn't look like he murdered them. Okay, so it's a much darker retelling of the story, but it's supposed to have some kind of comic effect. Okay, and again, trying to call it the quote-unquote true story of something is something that we see all throughout history. Okay, there are several instances where people try to write an expose and try to change a story that has a very traditional narrative, like we see with the previous two examples. And of course, there are much more lighthearted versions of this. Okay, Looney Tunes, for example, right? Any of the Looney Tunes cartoons typically has this type of situation occurring. Okay, Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. Okay, one of them is a protagonist and one is an antagonist. Okay, and in many people's minds, Bugs Bunny is the protagonist. He is a harmless animal who is living in the forest, and Elmer Fudd is the cruel hunter coming to shoot him. Okay. But you could turn this around as well. Okay, you could look at it and say that maybe Elmer Fudd is starving, maybe he has a family back home who needs to eat, and Bugs Bunny just happens to be the unfortunate creature that he has to kill and eat. Okay, but again, this is literary analysis coming forward in real time. Okay, and you see the same thing with other characters and in Looney Tunes as well, right? Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. Okay. Wile E. Coyote is constantly trying to catch the Roadrunner because he is hungry and because he wants to eat. And the Roadrunner constantly gives him grief for it, right? Constantly throws him off cliffs, right? Runs him into walls, gets crushed by rocks, all these kinds of things. So, again, it's done for comic effect, but looking for a protagonist and an antagonist is not always so simple. And even cartoons like Tom and Jerry. Okay, right, the cat and the mouse, right? We see the exact same thing happening, okay? In some of the cartoons, Tom is the protagonist. He's sometimes just taking a nap by the fire, and his owner screams when she sees a mouse and makes him get up and go chase after Jerry, okay? And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes Jerry is the one taking a nap in his mouse hole, and Tom is the one who comes across and tries to catch him and eat him and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and so it just kind of goes back and forth with each cartoon, right? Kind of keeps it up in the air and keeps the viewer guessing. So that's one way we typically tend to think about it, okay, in this dualistic, dichotic way, okay? Who is the good guy and who is the bad guy? But as you see, it's not always that easy. Now, another way that we can think about characters here happens, we usually don't see this happening until we get more and more into the story, okay? And we see the importance of characters based on how often they appear and what all they contribute to the story itself, okay? So you might have a primary character, for example. This is someone who appears constantly in the story, right? It's someone that we see all the time, okay? They're typically a person or a character who drives the story, okay? You know, it might be a full-fledged protagonist. It might be an antagonist, right? So Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd are both primary characters in their cartoons, okay? Sometimes they're the only characters, okay? And I like to think of this in terms of if you ever watch the Academy Awards or anything like that, you usually have an actor who wins an award for a leading role, okay? And that's what we're looking for here. A primary character is someone in a leading role, right? Someone we see all the time, okay? And the protagonist and an antagonist in most cases are usually primary characters, okay? Ones that we see all the time, the protagonist anyway always is. Secondary characters are characters who appear sometimes in a story, okay? If you have multiple characters, sometimes you'll have secondary characters who act as catalysts. And the word catalyst just means something or someone who makes a change occur. Okay, someone who maybe gives a little nudge to the storyline and takes it in a different direction. Okay? If you think about a modern example of this, think of the original Star Wars film, okay, if you're a fan of pop culture like me, okay? If you look at the original Star Wars film, okay, Luke Skywalker, of course, is a primary character, okay? He's a protagonist. We follow his character throughout the story. And a secondary character would be someone like Obi-Wan Kenobi, okay? Someone who gets him off of the farm and takes him away on an adventure. Okay? And so, and again, Obi-Wan doesn't appear all the time in the story. Okay, he eventually, you know, vanishes from the storyline. I won't give away anything, but characters like that are ones who actually end up affecting change somehow in the storyline, and they do have an important role to play, but they don't appear all the time. Okay, so this might be in terms of an award, right? You have someone who wins award for a leading role. And this would be someone who wins an award for a supporting role, right? A secondary character is a supporting character. And then the final term here is one you may not have even heard of before, but it is something that does still exist in these types of stories, and it's called a tertiary character. Tertiary is just a word that means third, okay? This is someone who may appear in name only. Okay, it may be someone who gets mentioned from time to time in a story, but they may never make an actual appearance. Okay, someone like a background character. Okay, someone if you think of it in terms of a film, right? Anytime that you're watching a movie, right, you have the primary and secondary characters interacting with each other in the foreground. Okay, and this is someone who may be walking by in the background. Okay, might be an extra, right? If you're thinking about a film role, right? Just someone who is walking by on a sidewalk. Might be someone who, again, gets mentioned a lot in dialogue or something, but never actually appears. Okay, and this is where you can see a little bit of crossover with what we talked about with the protagonist and antagonist way of thinking. Okay, an actual example of this might be from the Lord of the Rings. Okay. The primary antagonist of the story is actually a tertiary character. Okay, Sauron, right, this great Lord of Darkness and so forth, never actually appears in the story. Okay, he never appears in bodily form except in a flashback. Okay, so if you ever watch the films or if you read the book, Sauron never actually makes an actual appearance in the actual original version of the story. So again, this is, and even if you look at a book like the Christian Bible, or if you look at, even the Talmud or even the Quran or anything like that, there are references made to Satan or to Shaitan or to the enemy or something like that, but there's never actually, the devil only makes one or two very brief appearances. Okay, so it's a character that again doesn't. It's still an important character, but doesn't make a lot of appearances. It's kind of my point. So again, a tertiary character can still be an antagonist. Okay? And we'll even see that occur in this particular story, Lord of the Flies, as we move along. Okay, and I'll point it out when we get there. So one final way that we can look at characters here, now that I've kind of gotten long-winded here, is we have two different versions of characters who are categorized based on whether or not they are capable of change. Okay, so you might have a dynamic character, okay, and most of the time a protagonist in a story is a primary character and a dynamic character. Okay, they fit all three. They hit the trifecta, so to speak. A dynamic character is someone who undergoes change over the course of a story. Okay? And if you look even at the Star Wars films, Luke Skywalker completely changes over the course of all three films. Okay? He grows up, he becomes a much more serious character, much more powerful character. Okay? And we see this happen with a lot of different characters in literature. Okay? Even with the examples that we've mentioned. Okay, so typically a protagonist is one who is a dynamic character who undergoes a sense of change, and they're usually very easy to recognize for that reason. And the other version that we can look at here is a static character, and a static character is the opposite of a dynamic character. Okay, it's someone who does not change at all. Okay, and so a secondary character or a tertiary character might be a static one. Okay, even an antagonist might be a static one. It's just someone who they do not change at all from their first appearance to their last appearance. Okay? They remain the same for one reason or another. Okay? So anyway, characters are very complicated. Okay, and whenever you end up writing about character in the future, right, you might get a prompt to look at a story and look at the characters and write a paper about a character or characters. And quite often the most tempting thing for people to do in this case is if they are given the task of writing about a character is they tend to just basically regurgitate the entire story. Okay, but this can give you something more specific when it comes to writing about characters. Okay, gives you something much more complex to look at and to analyze. And you can get even into psychology with this. The psychologist Carl Jung, for example, went into a much longer detail about what we call archetypes in mythology and so forth. And archetypes are basically where you have characters who fall into a model example of one kind or another. And even with Joseph Campbell is another very interesting author to look at. Joseph Campbell was made famous by a book that he wrote called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And he took examples from Carl Jung and psychology and so forth and examined all of the myths that exist in all cultures all over the world and was able to pinpoint the idea that myths tend to follow a very specific pattern, okay, and that characters tend to evolve over the course of these myths. They become dynamic characters. They go through different trials, getting out of their comfort zone and facing enemies and all this kind of stuff, and eventually come out very different in the end. Okay? So I highly recommend looking at Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces to get a better perspective on this. Okay, but again, there's a lot to unpack here. Okay, a lot of very complicated things going on with characters, and characters tend to be part of what drives Lord of the Flies. Okay, so that's why I go into so much detail about this in the beginning, not to overwhelm you, but just to give you a sense of expectation here, and something that we can go back and look at a little bit more as we go along. Now, finally getting to the book itself. Okay, just looking at the cover art and getting a brief overview of the book will tell us a lot about kind of what's going on here in the story. Okay. The title of the book itself is something that, again, draws a lot of attention because it seems like a relatively uncomfortable title. Okay, Lord of the Flies seems like if you are giving this title to an individual, okay, it doesn't seem like something that they would want to have. Okay, and why is that, right? Why do we think about that in those terms? Okay. Specifically because if someone is Lord of the Flies, okay, flies tend to have a very negative connotation with us. right, in Western culture at least, right, in quote-unquote civilized culture, okay, flies are something irritating, right? They're something that we try to keep out of our houses. If they get into the house, we think they are making everything dirty. We associate them with filth of some kind. They tend to gravitate toward excrement, toward rotting things that have a particularly bad smell. Okay, so anytime that we see flies, we typically think, oh, something is dirty, we need to clean it, we need to get the flies out of here. Okay, it's something that we push away very consciously. Okay, so again, just associating that with the title, this is something that seems very bad. Okay. And looking at that compared to the cover art here, it seems like there's not really much of a connection, at least on the surface. Okay, and if you look at this a little bit deeper, okay, we already know what we associate flies with. The title Lord of the Flies seems to be something that is, granted as some kind of honorary title of some sort, but again, it seems dishonorable given what it's associated with. And if we think about traditional ideas of someone who might be a lord of flies, right? Someone who might be a lord of something that is dirty, filthy, rotting, stinking, everything that we hate, you might look and realize this is actually a biblical reference to Satan. Okay, and it comes in a very in one of the books, I believe, of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Talmud, that says that refers to the enemy or the devil or Satan as the Lord of the Flies. Okay, so now we have a much more specific way of looking at this. Okay, and again, not to just continue bringing up the devil. I'm not trying to promote anything here. This is really again, it's an association with something very negative. Okay, as a presence of evil of some sort in the story. And again, comparing that with the cover art that you see here in the background, it doesn't seem to link up very much. Okay, and that being said, what do we see in the cover art here? Okay, this is a kind of a jumbled mess here, right? It's kind of difficult to kind of pick out what's going on. We know that it's a very green scene, and if you look closely, you'll realize that this is a jungle setting. Okay, these are all ferns, palm trees, right, and all that kind of stuff. And down in the midst of the foliage, you see people moving around. Okay, you see individuals here. Okay, it's not only a jungle scene. There are people who are working. Okay, it looks like there are people who are, maybe gathering leaves here. They're gathering food. There's one individual who looks like they are making a bed or are sleeping. There is one fellow here who appears to be eating fruit, maybe a banana of some kind. People who are walking in a little line back here. There are some children. Okay, there's one fellow in the background here who appears to be climbing a very tall tree. Some of the characters are carrying what appear to be walking sticks or spears, perhaps. Okay, and for all intents and purposes, this might seem like that other side, at least in the author's mind anyway. And this is the first edition of the book. This would have appeared as the cover art for when the author wrote it for the first time. Okay, this might appear as a quote-unquote savage scene. Okay, at least in his mind. Okay, not advocating use of the term myself. Okay, I'm trying to point that out. But this is something that is the opposite of civilization. Okay, it's a wild scene. But if you look at the character down here at the bottom left, okay, this little fellow eating what looks like a banana, he's dressed very differently than everybody else. Okay, most of the other characters in the scene are very lightly clothed. Some of them appear to even be naked. But he actually is wearing what appear to be shorts, might even be wearing a shirt because it looks like he's got buttons here. I don't think he has two belly buttons. And he's even wearing a little beanie cap. Okay, he appears to kind of be out of his element here for some reason. Okay, and it leaves us kind of scratching our heads a bit. Okay, just looking at the cover of this book, we know that something is going on here that seems to be more than meets the eye. Okay, and now that we know that the meaning of the title is something associated with darkness or something potentially evil, again, the association for the author at least is to associate a wildness in nature and so forth as something potentially harboring evil, but we don't know what yet. Okay, so again, potentially misleading, but again, it gets us thinking, it gets us asking questions. And the other thing about this book, too, is it has 12 chapters in it, and each one of the chapters has a chapter title. Okay, and that's another reason I chose this book for the semester, because sometimes you'll get a book that is kind of boring when it comes to chapters. Okay, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 doesn't tell us anything. Okay, but this book actually does give us little hints about what's going to happen in an almost episodic way. Okay, so each chapter is kind of like its own little episode, maybe in a mini series of some kind, if you want to think of it like that. The first chapter is called The Sound of the Shell. Chapter 2 is Fire on the Mountain, Huts on the Beach, Painted Faces and Long Hair, Beast from Water, Beast from Air, Shadows and Tall Trees, A Gift for the Darkness, A View to a Death, The Shell and the Glasses, Castle Rock, and The Cry of the Hunters. Okay. And as you can tell, right, just looking at the different titles here, we know virtually nothing about what they mean in terms of the characters and the plot of the story necessarily, but we can understand that things seem to get progressively darker as the story drags on. Okay, we start from Sound of the Shell, which sounds like it might be something, potentially mystical and, potentially positive. We don't know. Huts on the Beach seems kind of, sounds like might be a nice vacation for some people. Okay. But it gets a little bit more, it gets a little wilder, right? Painted faces and long hair. That's a very specific image. We get into a beast of some kind, shadows, darkness, and then all of a sudden we hit death, right? So things seem like they're going to get darker as this story tends to progress. Okay. And again, this is something that most people don't stop to do. Okay, they tend to, again, judge a book by its cover, like we tell them not to. And we tend to do that, right? We look at the cover of a book and we're like, yeah, this looks interesting, or oh no, this doesn't look interesting, and we move on. Okay, but if you take a moment to examine these types of things, okay, it at least gets you thinking about the story, whether it's interesting to you or not. Now, moving into the first chapter, okay, we'll kind of go through this as quickly as we can here. One thing that's very important to this story is something called imagery. Okay, this is anything that appeals to the five senses. Okay, and the five senses are sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. Okay, and all of these things are things that we typically we experience them, of course, on a daily basis because we're humans, right? These are what we experience the world and life with. Okay. And anytime an author is able to use these things effectively to convey what a character looks like, what a setting looks like, what the weather is like, what something looks, smells, tastes like, whatever, it immerses us into the story more effectively. Okay? And imagery gets used not only in storytelling, it gets used in poetry, it gets used in music, gets used in art, right? All kinds of different things. And it enhances the way that we experience things, makes them more effective. So the setting of this story is something that is very important as well. And one thing that people don't always think about either is the fact that we can also associate the setting of a story with the character itself. And the setting can effectively become a character. Okay, and in this story, it's really the case. Okay, the setting is almost a tertiary character, right? Something that is going on in the background all the time. Okay, and it ends up affecting the other characters in the story. Okay. Now, for this particular setting, we are introduced to our first character on the very first page of the story, and he wakes up in a setting where there are palm trees behind him and all around him. There is an ocean on one side of him, and he's on a beach. Okay, okay, for all intents and purposes, again, this sounds like a pretty nice vacation. Okay, only problem is he seems very out of place. Okay, he's not dressed for the occasion. Okay, he's not wearing a swimsuit and enjoying, a nice cocktail or anything. Okay, we know that he is a young boy who is dressed in a school uniform. Okay, and he is we don't know really anything about his nationality. That's not really given to us. We don't know really much about his ethnicity even. Just that he is a young boy who awakens on a beach in a school uniform. And if he wakes up in a school uniform, and his uniform is tarnished, okay, it's torn, it's dirty, seems like he is very out of place. Something has happened to put him where he is. And in front of him, there is a jungle, okay? So there is no element of quote-unquote civilization anywhere around him except for the clothes he's wearing. Okay? So this seems like it's a very unsure situation at best. Okay? And he can hear exotic birds all around him. Okay, so this tells him that he's not in Kansas anymore, so to speak. Okay, he's not in a comfortable setting, right? He's in a very unfamiliar setting. And so this is where we get introduced more to the characters themselves. Okay, this first character is Ralph. Okay, and the image that you see here comes from the 1963 film. Okay, if you want an image of the character to go along with the description, this is what we know. And we're only told that he is a fair-haired boy. Okay, and the term fair-haired just means blonde. Okay, it's a traditional way of saying a blonde person. Okay. So Ralph is a blonde-haired boy waking up on a beach somewhere in what appears to be a tropical climate, right? It's hot. We're given that information too. It's a jungle with an ocean behind him, palm trees. He's on a beach. There are exotic birds everywhere. He is completely out of place. Okay? And we don't know his name until we get to our second character, who we're about to talk about now. But Ralph is kind of finding his way around here. Okay, he's stumbling around trying to figure out what's happened. He's taking in the imagery of everything around him. It's very green, blue sky above him, blue ocean behind him, white sands under his feet. He hears the birds, right? He feels the heat and the air, the humidity, the ocean breeze, and so forth. Could potentially be pleasant if he knew why he was there, but he doesn't yet. Okay. And the other distinct feature that we're told about here in terms of the setting is he recognizes what is described as a scar on the land itself. Okay, there is a gigantic scrape or a gigantic divot that is an impact is basically what has happened on the ground along the beach leading into the jungle. Okay, the ground is torn up. There's sand thrown everywhere. There are trees that have been knocked down, broken branches, palm leaves everywhere. Something has hit wherever he is. Okay, something big has made a large impact, but it's disappeared. We don't know what it is that has made this impact. Okay, whatever it is, though, it seems to be related to why he's there. Okay, and that's all we know so far. Okay. As Ralph starts to look around a little bit, he encounters our second character. Okay? And our second character is only described as being another young boy dressed very similarly to Ralph. He doesn't know this boy. He wears glasses, and he is described as being, quote, very fat. Okay? Again, that's a very subjective term for a lot of people, right? It's not, politically correct or anything like that. We won't pretend that it is, but in this particular case, the boy is simply described as wearing glasses and very fat. He is very different from Ralph. Okay, we don't know if Ralph is a good-looking kid or not, right? That's kind of immaterial here. Just that this particular character is distinctive in that he wears glasses and is very fat. Okay. So this second character is very different from Ralph, not only in appearance, but also in personality. He's very talkative, right? He starts talking to Ralph. He's very excited, wants to know what's going on, and is just very, very chatty, okay, to an annoying extent, okay, because Ralph very quickly tries to lose him, okay, tries to walk away from him. And this second boy, we never learn his true name in the course of the story. Okay? He never introduces himself by his birth name, so you can imagine what that might be. He only describes himself by the name that he is used as a bullying name. Okay, we know that he is bullied by other children at the school wherever he comes from, and he introduces himself as Piggy. Okay, and unfortunately, yes, this is a very negative name to assign to a character who appears to be an unfortunate figure. Okay, he's a bullied character for his weight. He wears glasses. He's squinting all the time, and he seems to have kind of an annoying personality. Okay, he seems a prime target for bullying. And the two of them, Ralph and Piggy, are now trying to determine what has happened here. Okay, they're looking around, and they're still kind of unsure of themselves. Okay, Ralph kind of starts to look around, see what he can find to determine this. They're kind of walking along the beach, and they find a big shell in the water. This is important for the remainder of the story. And I'll show you an image of it on the next slide. This is a thing called a conch shell. Okay, it's a very large seashell. Okay. And Piggy, of course, being a very talkative character, is also a know-it-all. Okay, he claims to know a lot about this particular type of shell, and he tells Ralph, he says, "Oh yeah, they're very expensive and very rare, and my auntie had one," and all this kind of stuff, telling irrelevant information to Ralph. But the one thing that Piggy does say about it is he says, if you blow into one end of it, it sounds like a trumpet. He says you can make it into a trumpet if you want. And so Ralph tries it, okay? And when he first tries it, this is where we are reminded of the fact that these two are boys, okay? And over the course of the story, we are only kind of hinted at their age, right? We know that these boys are somewhere between the ages of 10 and 12, okay? And based on the pictures that you see here, it's pretty accurate, okay, for the description given in the book. So when Ralph tries to blow into it for the first time, it makes a sound like, right? And both boys start laughing. Okay, because it sounds funny, okay? So immediately we're reminded that these are boys put into an unpredictable situation, okay? They're going to laugh, they're going to cut up, they're not going to focus really on what's going on immediately, okay? They're not adults, okay? And so they start goofing off, right? They start playing around in the water, they start doing handstands and just acting silly, acting like kids, okay? And once Ralph tries to blow into it again, it does actually sound like a trumpet. Okay? It makes a loud, blasting horn sound that kind of echoes throughout wherever they are. Okay? And he realizes just how much the sound is carried and thinks that this may or may not be a good idea, okay? Because we don't know exactly what else is out there. But after he does this, soon they start to realize that more boys are appearing. Okay? Boys are climbing out from under the palm leaves. Some of them are coming out of the jungle. Some of them are walking up the beach. And pretty soon they realize they have a small collective of boys that have gathered together on the beach. We're never told exactly how many. Okay, we can imagine there's maybe a couple of dozen, maybe as many as 30. It could be even as many as 50 or 100, even if you want to go that far with it. I usually imagine that there's maybe between 2 and 3 dozen. I'm guessing maybe 30 boys. And they're all kind of dressed similarly. Okay, some of them are in various stages of undress, right? They've taken off school uniforms. It's hot, right? They're trying to get comfortable and so forth. And as they're all gathered, one other group comes marching up the beach. And this group of boys is extremely different from the other group, okay? And they're led by this boy, okay? And as you can see, he's dressed very, very differently from the others. Okay? And this boy introduces himself as Jack Merridew, okay? Jack, for the remainder of the story, is all he's called. And Jack is older than the other boys. He's more like 12, right? The other boys are maybe 10 or 11. And Jack is dressed in the garb of a boys' choir, okay? He's wearing a cap on top that looks kind of like a cardinal's cap, if you've ever seen like a Catholic church ceremony of some kind, right? This is a traditional way of dressing. He's got this frilly collar, right? Very thick collar. He's wearing a uniform underneath, and he's wearing a very long, thick cape, okay? So again, he looks, it's a very ritualistic type of garb. And again, he is leading a group of boys, maybe half a dozen, 10 of these boys up the beach, and they're marching in formation almost like soldiers. Okay, they're very well, they're much cleaner, they're much more organized, and Jack seems to be, again, the one leading them and the one in charge. Okay, and they're very regimented. They halt and stop and stand at attention and all this kind of stuff. And once they all start talking, they start to piece together exactly what's happened here. And it appears that they have just experienced a plane crash. Okay? All of the boys have survived, obviously. And the other thing that they realize here is that there are no adults around. Okay? If there were any adults with them on this plane, which evidently there was a pilot at least, excuse me, there are no chaperones, right? There are no adults to watch over the children. Okay? If there were any adults, it appears they may have died on impact or drowned in the ocean. Okay. Excuse me. And the other thing that that they determine, right? They determine they've been in a plane crash. That explains this big impact crater that's happened. They want to know where the plane has gone. And Piggy points out that there was a large storm that happened the night before. Okay, it explains why so many of the boys are dirty and wet and so forth, why their clothes are torn and that kind of thing. But he explains that the ocean came in and a large tidal wave washed the plane back out to sea. Okay? So this has to have been a very large storm to do this because of how many boys there are and how big this plane would have had to be. So, for all intents and purposes, it sounds like these boys are now stranded on what appears to be a deserted island. Okay, and that's essentially what's going on now. Okay, this is a group of young boys with no adults to watch over them who are now stranded together on an island. And again, there's a crowd of other boys there who are gathered together. We don't really know. There may be as few as 10, as many as 20 or 30, or as many number as you'd like to guess. Okay, they would have to all fit on apparently one plane, though. So it's kind of difficult to determine. So again, what has happened? These boys have been in a plane crash. Why has the plane crashed? We don't know that yet. Okay, we're not really told much. Piggy determines that they were on their way home, wherever home happens to be. Okay, so it seems like these boys might all be from the same nationality, right? They might be from the same country, same culture. They at least all speak the same language that we know. But now they are on what appears to be a deserted island. It appears that there is no one else around them. There are at least no adults. There are no other people of any kind, no structures that they can find. And all the adults are apparently dead. Okay, we don't know of any adults that do survive. The 1990 film version of this does include one adult who survives. He doesn't last very long, though. Now, the first thing that these boys decide to do, okay, is they all try to call upon what adults would do in this situation. Okay, they try to mimic adults in this way. And they decide they're going to hold a democratic election to decide who is going to be their leader. Okay? Jack, of course, immediately puts himself forward because Jack, of course, is the oldest. He's about 12. And the other boys, though, choose Ralph because Ralph is the one who found the conch shell, who blew the shell, called all the boys together, and who appears to have led them all to this point in the first place. Okay? And so Jack is elected, or Ralph is elected as the leader of the group, and Jack becomes very resentful of this. So already we have a conflict brewing here. We have a protagonist in the character of Ralph, and it seems like we're starting to build an antagonist in the form of Jack. So we're already in the first chapter here being given two primary characters who appear to be at odds with one another. Okay, we're already starting the drama. Now, from this point forward, we have a few items here that are very symbolic. Okay, and when we talk about symbolism, this is another thing that comes into play with literary analysis. Okay, symbolism here refers to any items that represent an idea of some kind. Okay, and in this particular case, the only thing that we're told about so far that is symbolic is the conch shell, and this is a conch if you've never seen one. Okay, some people might have a relative or someone who has one of these on their mantle or something like that. My grandmother had one of these. But a conch shell in this particular case represents law, order, rules, some structure and form of government, okay, a democracy in this particular case, right, where everybody votes on who they want to be their leader, okay. So the conch shell is kind of this item that they all decide is going to be a symbol of power. Okay, it's a symbol of this order. Okay, to what these boys are experiencing. Now again, we've talked already about some of the themes, right? This is a message that the author is trying to convey somehow to the audience about the story and the characters and everything. The civilization versus savagery is something that we're already beginning to see. Okay, these boys are all from a quote-unquote civilized world. Okay, it appears that they may be, for all intents and purposes, if we go with the author's background, they're probably British school children. Okay, they come from a world that appears to be very privileged. They're all wearing uniforms. right? Some of them are members of a boys' choir. It appears that they are healthy, well-fed, right? We have Piggy, who's fat, obviously. His family can afford glasses and so forth. These are privileged school children who have had adults looking after them their entire lives. Okay? And the setting that they are literally dumped into here is a savage one. Okay, there appears to be no other adults around, and they are being put into a survival situation. Okay, no one is there to take care of them anymore. Okay, so now they have to contend with the world around them, right? This island that they're on. How are they going to get home? Okay, are they going to get home? Okay, how are they going to feed themselves? How are they going to clothe themselves? How are they going to build shelter and find food? Okay, so there's all kinds of things now that these boys have to look forward to. And of course, they are humans interacting with nature here, and nature seems to be very unforgiving. Okay, for all we know, nature is what has caused them to get here in the first place, right? Was it a storm that brought the plane down? Okay, the plane is obviously gone because of a storm. Okay, and a tropical storm without shelter is something that in some cases is not survivable. Okay, especially for boys in this situation. And of course, order and chaos are two big things now too. Okay, the conch shell and attempting to mimic what adults do represents order. Okay, and of course, the island and everything around them is chaos. Okay, there is no order to it. These boys have to make order out of chaos. And of course, there is a general fear of the unknown here. The boys have no idea where they are. They have no idea what day it is, what time it is, what's happened, where the other adults are. They know, nothing about what lives on the island. Are there animals there? Is there something that can hurt them there? Okay. Are there people there who can hurt them? Right. There's all kinds of things. There's a lot of unknowns here. And this is something that we can categorize potentially as a coming-of-age story. Okay, this is a very specific type of story that follows boys becoming men to a certain degree. Okay, these boys are going to find ways of maturing in one way or another. Okay, of at least interacting with one another, competing with one another in some cases. But a coming-of-age story is where boys essentially, and not just boys, right? This can be girls too, right? There is actually, as far as I know, there is a film version being done right now with an all-female cast of this particular story. So it could potentially translate the same way. Basically, where a child gains experience and comes out better, changes over the course of all this. That's a coming-of-age story. Now, chapter 2 is a little bit shorter than the first chapter, so we'll kind of go through it a little bit quicker here. The boys start to kind of explore the immediate area around them. Okay, they don't go very far, but they go a little bit into the jungle, a little bit up and down the beach, and they come back together after Ralph blows the conch shell again, and they make two different conclusions here. First conclusion is that they are effectively alone on the island. Okay, they realize that there are apparently no adults. There are no other civilizations, right? They have no idea where they are. And this has a very different effect on some boys than it does on others. Okay, and this is where we get a little bit of a better idea of the makeup of the crowd of these boys. Okay, we're told that they range anywhere from the ages of 6 all the way up to 12. Okay, so there are some children here who are very, very young. They are very little kids. Okay, these are kids who, without the aid of someone older than them, they would not survive at all. Okay, they don't know how to fend for themselves, to find food or shelter or anything. Okay, they need someone to take care of them. Okay, so for these boys to not have any kind of help is something that's very dangerous. And the other thing that they discover is that there are wild pigs living on this island. Okay, and wild pigs are very dangerous. Okay, these are creatures that if you find a male one of these, they can cut you up pretty bad with their tusks. Sometimes these things do get to be very vicious and will attack people relentlessly. So again, these boys have no defenses that we know of, right? We don't know if any of them are carrying a pocket knife or anything that they can even fashion into a weapon. Okay, but pigs could potentially mean food. Okay, And the other thing about the pigs themselves, too, is something very specific here, and we'll talk a little bit more about it here in a second. So something to keep in mind about pigs. Ralph decides that he is going to divvy up responsibilities here because he's been elected the leader. Okay, he says that he and a small group of boys are going to be in charge of building shelter. Okay, so Ralph becomes kind of the caretaker of the boys here. Okay, he seems to take on, if you want to look at it and this is not really even accurate. Okay, I certainly don't want to put forth this kind of idea, but he's the nurturer of the group. Okay. Nurturing in a traditional sense, and when I say traditional, I don't necessarily mean something that's always reflective in today's society, but it's not politically correct anyway, is saying that Ralph takes on a much more of a feminine type thing, okay? And again, I'm not trying to advocate for a dichotomy between male and female and that kind of thing. I'm looking at something objectively here that is typically used through the lens of a white British male living in the 20th century, okay? Ralph is given the more passive responsibility here, okay, the more nurturing responsibility, providing shelter, providing something that is of comfort, right, to the other boys. Jack is given the more male-dominant way of doing things. He is put in charge of hunting. Okay, Jack is the oldest. He seems to be a little bit more ambitious. Perhaps he'll do a better job of hunting than Ralph will. Okay, so Jack is put in charge of hunting for food, and he and a group of boys, primarily the boys' choir, are all banded together as hunters. Okay. Now, talking again about pigs here. In a lot of cultures around the world, pigs are considered to be taboo, right? Taboo means that they are something that is not to be touched, not to be approached, not to even be discussed in some cases, okay? We have this image of pigs as being dirty, of being unclean even by some cultures and even some religions, okay? Judaism and Islam, for example, consider pigs to be completely unclean, okay? Something that you're not supposed to eat swine flesh, you're not supposed to eat pork products of any kind, because God has somehow declared that pigs are unclean, okay? And there's all kinds of ways that you can examine this. You might even think about it in terms of the fact that pigs are actually, in many ways, very similar to humans, okay? They are intelligent creatures. There are some ways that pigs and humans actually share a very similar biology in terms of how they reproduce and how they gestate offspring. We can actually share a certain amount of genetic material with them. In some cases, even pig organs and pig blood have been used in some primitive ways, at least, of doing surgeries and so forth with humans, right? There is a connectability there, okay? There's a compatibility to a certain extent, and even in some analyses that I've heard before, when it comes to and this goes back to the idea of civilization and savagery, the eating of human flesh by cannibalistic cultures, okay, has been described in many ways. Human flesh is described as tasting very much like a pork product. Okay? And again, I don't know that from personal experience, but in some cultures, in some marketplaces in far ends of the world, okay, and this goes back into the author's idea of civilization and savagery. Sometimes human flesh would be sold at some markets in some places in the world during earlier centuries, and it was actually given the euphemistic term long pig, okay, because it seemed so much like a pork product. Okay, so there's an uncomfortable similarity between humans and pigs, and even to the sound that a pig makes, okay, when it is even when it's slaughtered. Okay, it's hauntingly similar to the scream of a human. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there and a lot of uncomfortable things that people don't want to confront about pigs. But pig imagery continues to make a reappearance in this story. It's no coincidence that we have a character named Piggy. Okay, and Piggy is an uncomfortable character. Okay, he's one that people don't like to associate with. Okay. So pigs are an uncomfortable reality that these boys have to deal with. And again, we know nothing about these boys in terms of their nationality or in terms of their ethical or religious beliefs. If any of these boys keep kosher or halal or anything like that, we don't know if they adhere to a religious diet or ethics or anything like that. Okay, but for some readers, this may seem a little bit uncomfortable. So I put that disclaimer out there. Jack, though, is unable to kill a pig willingly. Okay? In the course of this story, he fails time and time and time again. Anytime that he does find a pig, he fails to make a killing stroke. Okay? He might fashion a spear and throw it and miss. He might hesitate and the pig gets away. Right? There's all kinds of situations where Jack has to. He's like many of the readers in that he feels uncomfortable with pigs, okay? And that he's unable to come to terms with it and kill one. Now, rescue is something that we think is probably a remote possibility at this point, right? We don't know if these boys are actually going to get off this island or not, okay? And what makes things worse in the midst of all this is a little backwards on the slideshow, apologize, is, again, these boys have already determined that they are alone on the island, and this has two different reactions, okay? Some boys, if you tell them that they are alone somewhere, they're going to get excited because there's no grown-ups to tell them what to do. Okay? They're going to start acting up and cutting up and just running around and acting goofball, and because they think they're free. Bear in mind, though, again, that these boys age from 6 to 12. Okay, little kids are going to be scared out of their minds if they know that they are left alone without an adult to take care of them. And some of the boys start to panic about this. Okay, some of them think that they are not going to get off the island, that they are going to die there. Okay, and Piggy himself is one who starts to panic a little bit. Okay, because remember, we know already that Piggy has been bullied. And if you are bullied, if you've ever had the experience of being bullied, quite often your only recourse and your only salvation is an adult. Okay, someone who is able to intervene, protect you, and that sort of thing. Okay, and in this case, because there are no adults, Piggy knows that he is effectively a sitting duck. He knows that people are going to be able to bully him with abandon, that he's not going to be able to get away from them. So this is a situation that merits panic in his mind. And he does start to panic very quickly. He starts to say, we're going to die here, we're not going to get out of here, and all this kind of stuff. And one young boy speaks up, one of the littler kids, and says that he has seen a quote-unquote beastie on the island. And by beastie, we mean monster. And he describes this monster as being some kind of snake-like creature that he has seen nearby, okay? And again, this is a completely alien setting to these kids, right? They have never experienced anything like this before, from what we can tell. And so it's very easy for their mind to play tricks on them. Perhaps there are snakes on the island. Okay, it seems like a tropical climate. It might very well follow that that's what's happened. But for all intents and purposes, these boys claim that now they think there is a monster on the island. And if there really is a monster, and there are no adults around, now kids are really going to panic, okay? So again, if you have children, or of course we've all been children ourselves, we've all feared some sort of creature lurking in the darkness at some point, hiding in a closet or under a bed or something along those lines. Typically an adult has to come in and reassure us, okay? Scare the monster away or turn on a nightlight or whatever. Tell us it's okay. These boys don't have that. Okay? So this increases the tension more for the story here. Okay? If there is in fact a monster, there's nothing to protect these boys, and if nothing else, these boys are scared and alone. Okay? So all of this builds up to the idea that these boys need some way of contacting the outside world, gaining attention, for people to come and rescue them if that is going to actually happen. Okay? They need to at least try. And Piggy is actually the one who comes up with the idea for them to do this, although Ralph is the one who actually conveys it to everybody else, and that is to build a signal fire. Okay, so these boys we have to look at the geography of this island a little bit more here, because the island itself appears to be not a very flat island, right? There is actually a mountain in the middle of it. Okay, and these boys are down on the beach. Okay, so they actually have to make a big hike up to the top of this mountain to build this fire if they want it to travel anywhere. They want people to see a signal fire, you have to build it from the highest point. So they go all the way up to the top. They scramble up the mountain very quickly, okay? And we're not really told how long it takes them, although it appears to take them quite a while because this is a big place. They have to contend with jungle and all that kind of stuff to get there. And when they get up to the top, they realize they don't really have anything to make a fire with. Okay, they have no tools of any kind. But Ralph here actually shows a little bit of ingenuity, and that he realizes that Piggy's glasses are a tool that he can actually use. And I use this image of glasses because this is probably what a young schoolboy from the time period would wear, right? Kind of like the Harry Potter looking glasses. He takes Piggy's glasses, and if you've ever seen this done in a science class or an experiment of some kind, this is something that can be done, although it's kind of hard to do, is you can take something like a magnifying glass, or glasses in some cases if they're thick enough, and if you hold them up in the sunlight to a certain angle, the sunlight shines down through the lenses and makes a small beam of light that gets concentrated into a fine point underneath it, right? It gets filtered through the glass lens. And when this fine point of light lands on something that's flammable, it can potentially catch it on fire. Okay? And that's exactly what ends up happening here. Okay? Ralph takes Piggy's glasses, borrows them here, and uses them to burn some dry grass, which then catches fire, and the boys end up with a signal fire. Okay? It's a pretty ingenious way of doing this. Okay? Again, shows that some of these boys, Ralph in particular, might have a little bit of knowledge of survival. It seems like he, in fact, I want to say he even says he reads it in a book somewhere, that he knows how to do this. So he seems intelligent. Problem with this, though, is suddenly the signal fire burns out of control. Okay, these boys are on a jungle island after all. There's tons of foliage around. There's tons of things that can catch fire. These boys don't really think about containing the fire. They don't think about putting rocks around it or building a pit or anything like that to prevent other things from catching fire. And so suddenly it burns very far out of control. And in the film, you see this catching trees on fire and grass and everything else. And in the midst of all this, the young boy who claims to have seen a monster goes missing. And this is a situation where suddenly conflict becomes much more real to these boys, okay? Because the signal fire is something that sends the boys into a complete tailspin. They're frantically trying to put it out. It has apparently caught many trees on fire, shrubbery, and so forth. And we never learn what has actually happened to this young boy. For all intents and purposes, it seems like this boy has been burned to death. He has very likely gotten scared. We know he's a younger boy. Okay? He may be as young as 6. He obviously has not known what to do in a fire. Okay? He may have run into the jungle and gotten trapped and died of smoke inhalation or whatever. His body is never recovered. Okay? So now we have a first death in this book. Okay? And the other boys don't exactly know how to react to this. Okay, the fact that this is the boy who's seen the monster is very profound to them, though, because it seems like this boy may have paid with his life for seeing the monster. They think the monster might have eaten him, might have come out while the fire was going on, while they were distracted, and have taken this boy. And it leaves the reader scratching their head, too, right? Is this really a thing? Okay. Rationally speaking, we might say that this boy probably has likely perished in the fire, but there is that lingering doubt. Is there really a monster there? Okay. Did this boy get gobbled up by it? We don't know. We don't know how much realism is supposed to take place in this book yet. And so this leaves the other boys concerned now, especially the little kids, because they're now traumatized by this. They think that this boy has been eaten by this monster and that they are next. Okay. And the older boys are even kind of starting to look over their shoulder a little bit. They're a little worried about this. But the boys collectively are not sure how to respond to death. They're not sure what to do in this particular situation, okay? And if you have ever seen a young child experience death, or if you yourself experienced death as a young child, okay, you don't always know how to deal with it, Okay, my grandfather died when I was 5 years old, and I didn't know how to process it really. Okay, for many children, a person is there one day and they're gone the next. Okay, and there's not really any effective explanation you can give a child to really help them understand it very well. Some people use religion to do it, right, to explain an afterlife or something like that. Try to provide comfort of some sort. Usually, though, the adults are the ones who handle death for the children. They do it on their behalf. They at least provide comfort of some kind if the child is experiencing it. And in this particular case, it seems like there are no adults around to do it for them, so they don't know how to react. Okay, the sense of permanence when it comes to death is something that they are afraid of, and it goes back to the fear of the unknown. And Ralph is really the only one here who seems to respond to this, who seems to handle death on everyone else's behalf. Okay? So, lot to unpack, okay, for these first couple of chapters, okay? But this gives you a general understanding of what this story is going to be like, what to expect from the characters and the setting. A lot of questions remain unanswered, okay? But now we know what the first two chapter titles mean. Sound of the Shell refers to the conch. Chapter 2, Fire on the Mountain, is the signal fire, okay? So that wraps up our first discussion. This one went relatively long, okay? Hour and a half is usually what a typical long semester class period is. For summer, usually it goes for quite a bit longer than this, usually for a couple of hours or more. But for the purposes of this, I don't want to overwhelm you too much. Okay, so this will probably be the longest discussion that we have over the book itself. Okay, most of the time it might not be more than half an hour. All right, so that wraps it up for this first discussion. Head on over to your discussion board and take a look at the first set of discussion questions, and I will see you all next time. Thanks, guys.